Boa tarde, boa noite a todas e a todos. Eu agradeço a presença de vocês e informo que essa live precisa ser necessariamente em inglês. Eu vou passar agora a fazer a apresentação em inglês, assim como todo o resto do evento. Good evening, everyone. My name is Gustavo Pedrollo. I am an associate and one of the founders of APD, Associação Advogadas e Advogados Públicos para a Democracia. I'm glad to welcome you all for another Democratic Coffee, Café Democrático, which is an event supported by the association. It used to be, of course, presential. It's now virtual. And today we're going to talk about avenues for democratic experimentalism, environmental governance in Brazil in times of crisis. And we have the honor and privilege to receive Professor Charles Sabel to deliver his talk on these issues here with us today. Professor Sabel was the fourth International Professor of Social Science at MIT, and today he's a Professor of Law and Social Sciences at the Columbia Law School. Professor Sabel's work covers a wide range of topics, including on the US philosophical tradition of pragmatism and the ideas of democratic experimentalism and deliberative democracy. He has long been concerned with practical problems of public policies, including regulation of trade, climate change, Japanese production methods like Toyotism, understood as the institutionalization of decentralized learning, and the application of this method to public administration, economic models for development and creation of good jobs and innovation, the quality hurdle in industry, effects of uncertainty in administrative law, and so on, so on. Our main goal here is to spread the experimentalist ideas, Professor Sabel, that you embody so very well. As a visiting scholar at Columbia Law School, I was accepted to audit 2 of Professor Sabel's courses, and it was an amazing opportunity to discuss all these subjects under a brilliantly applied Socratic method. And actually, that's the one thing I regret about the limits of the interaction in virtual discussions like this one, because I would really like people to observe how Professor Sabel conducts a class with questions and answers and leading students to always very interesting, sometimes unexpected and disruptive conclusions. It's really an amazing experience. To debate with Professor Sabel, we have 2 amazing young Brazilian scholars who, like me, are great admirers of Professor Sabel's work. We have Isabela Morbach Silva, who's a PhD candidate in Energy at USP, Universidade de São Paulo, University of São Paulo. Has a master's degree in economic and financial law, also from USP. Worked as a doctoral visiting researcher at the Imperial College of London Centre for Environmental Policy. And we have also Vitor, who is a PhD candidate in sociology at Indiana-Bloomington, holding a master's degree in law from the same university and also from FGV, Fundação Getúlio Vargas, São Paulo. Professor Sabel will speak, and then we'll be followed by questions and answers and comments with Isabela, Vitor, the audience, and myself. Professor Sabel, once more, thank you so very much for accepting our invitation. We are really, I can't express how happy we are to have you here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gustavo. The pleasure and the honor are completely mine, and I have to say, learning that this meeting is called a Café Democrático is an additional enticement. It's a perfect name. I wish we had such a regular thing here. Although today was inauguration day, and under the circumstances, it justifies a lot of commemoration, I guess. So let me just go right to things and underscore something that you said, Gustavo, that the format, welcome as it is, as a chance to meet people and exchange ideas and to engage in discussion, it's awkward because it's compressed, because it's virtual, and especially because on the one hand, I don't know enough about the background of many people in the audience, or any actually other than you, Gustavo, and Vitor, to know how to address matters of concern and to present the ideas in a way that's most likely either to elicit affirmation or a pointed criticism. So that's one limit. And the other limit is that I don't know enough about Brazil to translate these ideas into concrete examples and proposals at the level of detail that would be required to test these ideas and subject them to your scrutiny. So nonetheless, I'm going to try to do both things, talk to people in their, to me, unknown heterogeneity, and pretend with a great deal of modesty to enough superficial knowledge about Brazil to be able to sketch an application of these ideas in the very difficult area of environmentalism, difficult all over the world and not particularly in Brazil. So briefly, to the conceptual background of experimentalism, and I'm going to not go back to the pragmatic understandings of this and leave the philosophical and theoretic background in the background, rather than try to be explicit about it. So let me just, in a compressed way, present some of the core ideas. The foundational idea, from the point of view of the things we want to discuss today, is the notion of uncertainty, which is technically defined as the inability to anticipate states of the world with enough reliability and foresight to be able to write a probability distribution for their occurrence. So when you don't even know what the possible states of the world are, you certainly can't estimate the probability of them occurring. And when you have a situation where things change in this unforeseeable way regularly, that's uncertainty. I mean, we're all familiar with the fact, but it's useful to contrast it with the usual decision theoretic background of states that can be probabilistically estimated. So what changes? Forget about why the world has become more uncertain. Let's assume for a second that it is. What difference does it make to law? What difference does it make to the organization of public administration? And ultimately, though we won't discuss this, to democracy itself. Well, the foundation of conventional ideas of democracy, conventional ideas of law, assumes a principal-agent relation. The principal is some actor who is able to foresee projects, the desirability of projects, with enough reliability to be able to engage other actors, agents, in the realization of those projects, create incentives for those agents to act to further the project and to correct, punish the agents or reward them depending on their ability to pursue the promised goals. So the sovereign people, the democratic public, can be the principal, and the legislature can be the agent, and then public administration can be the agent of the agent in elaborating laws that have been authorized by the sovereign and putting them into application. That's very familiar. The principal can be one contractual partner who hires another contractual partner to execute some task, creates an incentive, and it promises to pay a price for achieving the agreed goals. The principal could be the regulator, who is charged, again, through a process of delegation by the public, but is effectively a second-level principal, with creating a system of rewards and sanctions to induce the regulated entities to act in the public interest. And so these are all classic principal-agent relations. They're in many ways the foundation of both public and private law. So you could argue about what's the most fundamental thing. If this principal-agent relation becomes unworkable, that's a fundamental change. And it obviously does become more unworkable under uncertainty, because the most immediate implication of uncertainty at the practical level is that if you can't foresee future states of the world, you can't be a principal in the traditional sense of having a well-defined project, a project sufficiently well-defined that you can confidently create incentives for its realization to attract and guide agents, and then correct the behavior of the agents as intermediate results come in. You can't do that because you don't know enough to specify what the goal should be, because you don't know what you have a goal. You understand that there are deep aims, general aims you want to pursue, but you're not sure of the best way to pursue them, and you're not sure, even as you come closer to specifying what your end might be, there's uncertainty regarding the means. And this is not your uncertainty alone. It's not that you are distant from events, and because of this distance, unable to act with the necessary precision. The agent doesn't know either. So it's necessary to create, instead of a relation where one part of the agreement is a knowing actor who can direct with precision, it's necessary to create a relation where both parties learn both what is possible as they more fully specify what it is that they actually intend to do. Now, we have very clear examples of that in private in private law and contracting, as firms, advanced firms, increasingly collaborate with each other to do innovative things that none of them have fully done before. They enter into new kinds of contracts where they don't promise a certain to perform in certain ways in return for a fixed price or a variable price depending on the outcome. Rather, they agree to advance part of the way towards the project, exchange ideas about how to go further, test those ideas together, make a joint determination, and in the very process of determining whether the project is feasible, some variant of the project is feasible, they come to understand one another's capacities, whether they can work together, whether there's a danger of opportunism, and so on. So a whole machinery called contract law, which is traditionally designed to assign risks in these kinds of collaborations so that the initiating agent can achieve her goals at an acceptable level of risk, turns into a much more collaborative relationship. And the same thing begins to happen in regulation. In the normal understanding of regulation in a stable world, the regulator is actually quite ignorant of the risks that the regulated entity faces. The regulated entity has a much better understanding of the risks and the costs of mitigating them. This is very familiar in the same way that when you hire a doctor as your agent, the doctor knows much more about whatever illness you're likely to have than you do. Nonetheless, you have some confidence that you have ways of eliciting enough information from the doctor to be able to check that her pursuit of your health is proceeding adequately. So similarly, the job of the traditional regulator is in effect to find a way of enticing enough information from the regulated entities to mitigate the asymmetry of their knowledge. The regulated entity knows more, and to design an incentive system that induces behavior conforming to the public good. Supposing, let's take obvious cases. There are new vaccines or other pharmaceuticals that are urgently needed, and they can be tested to assure levels of safety that are adequate to the current moment, but it would take a very long time to test them so adequately that you could rule out the real likelihood of adverse effects. By the way, it turns out this is not just true of vaccines. It's true of basically all medicines. They simply can't be, it's impossible to test them for long enough to ascertain to know what the long-term risks of exposure will be, or what the risks to genetic previously unidentified genetic subpopulations will be. If there is a group of first people and you don't know enough about their genome to include them in the test, it may turn out that the drug has a bad effect on them. And the only way of determining that is to put the drug into general use and then to learn very rapidly about possible signs of dangerous effects so that no one is actually hurt by the discovery of a latent defect, and so on. I can give one example after, of this kind of transformation after another, but you get the idea. The trick is figuring in each situation a concrete way of actually organizing this collaboration, this information exchange, so that the parties are not tempted to presume greater knowledge of the future than they can possibly have, but rather learn very rapidly from failures, half measures, surprises of all kinds, disappointment of expectations, what it is both that they need to know and how they ought to learn that. So the point is to design a regime specific to contracting, to specific to regulation, and the same thing could be said about government services, which allows for this kind of learning as a substitute for the stability that allowed people to largely eliminate these kinds of risks ex ante before agreeing to do something. So just to complete so that a word about contracting, a word about regulation, just a word about services. So you see the analogy. Many traditional welfare services or educational services are provided on their mass programs. All children of a certain age get the same public education in theory. But as populations become more heterogeneous, and becomes clearer that effective provision of service, either in healthcare or in education or in welfare, social welfare, depends on actually addressing a combination of individual needs. So that if you don't address the whole range of needs simultaneously, the individual pieces will be less effective. You have to begin to customize services, adjust. You can't just assign them on the basis of programs that are designed for broad categories ex ante. So once again, you have to learn very quickly how to integrate things in the interest of addressing more particularized need. So the problems across a wide range of experience, private and public, change their nature once uncertainty is introduced. And the strong claim of experimentalism is that not only that this change, it's actually not very contentious that there is a change of this kind. It's normally perceived as a kind of creeping inevitable crisis of ungovernability. The way we come to grips with these changes is to say that big government doesn't work or government doesn't work. And we've had a long experience in the last decades of assuming that government doesn't work and that the alternative was a world based as far as possible on markets, neoliberalism. And I won't go through. That's an experiment that's been tried. I mean, having this conversation 10 years ago, it would be necessary to start by saying, look, there are limits to the marketization, and here's what they are, and we can anticipate that sooner or later people will turn away from this program. That's already happened. That is, it's however pervasive those ideas are, they're an old habit that people are not clinging to, not even in the United States. That's a remarkable thing about current politics in the United States is the old dogmas of the market they're recollections. They're not active. They're, as long as there's nothing better, people will talk about the market. The minute there's an alternative, even a crazy alternative, people are very eager to embrace it. So the strong claim of experimentalism is that it is possible to design institutions that meet the forms of uncertainty that have been in substantial measure, not exclusively, but in substantial measure, responsible for the difficulties of familiar forms of principal agent, top-down, command and control, hierarchical government, all rough, very rough synonyms. And many of them are already in practice and they work. And a lot of the literature in experimentalism is, I don't know, reasonably, let's say, serious efforts. How successful is for you to judge, but anyway, really well-intentioned and serious efforts to demonstrate the workability of these alternative institutional mechanisms. There isn't time. I mean, there's a choice here: either illustrate one or another in enough detail to make it clear how it works, and to connect the micro mechanisms of its operation with the large ideas of learning under uncertainty, or just plow ahead and say that if you get interested in this, you'll pursue you can easily enough find examples on which you can subject these ideas to your own scrutiny in practice. So let me switch then against this background of saying that there's an increase in uncertainty. It disconcerts, it disrupts, to use the a kind of very modern. By the way, I should say that's a useful point. Do you? I assume you all have use or hear the word disruption sufficiently often so that it's a cliche. Well, it's important to notice that it's a new cliche. That's how quickly things get cliched. It's a cliche that was created by a Harvard Business School professor. And he was writing, his theme was the absolute unpredictability of markets and the failure of traditional business organizations to be able, given this uncertainty, to operate the way they did. And therefore, because they could not see the future and nonetheless were attached to a set of practices that gave them false confidence that they proved to be vulnerable to disruption, being overtaken by competitors whose very existence they couldn't anticipate. So they were in competition with people they thought they could outcompete, and uncertainty, the unpredictability of the new source of competition, regularly disrupted them. So the idea of uncertainty being disrupted that idea is already in part a sign, that locution is already in part a sign of the pervasiveness of uncertainty, because everybody understands, whatever you think about the word, everybody understands that this is the fact. Okay. So now I want to come, forgive me, there are just Gustavo is actually very kind in his introduction, but what he didn't say was I have to do the Socratic method because the method that I'm trying now, which is to be completely compressed and yet respectful of your own engagements and diversity of background, I'm no good at doing that. So I'm going to fall short. And but I recognize where that is, and maybe in the discussion we can fill in some of the missing pieces. So let me switch to the crazy example that I want to present to you, which is the example of environmentalism in Brazil, and particularly the Amazon. And I want to present it to you as under two aspects. First, as the complete and utter failure of the traditional form of regulation and government intervention. As a complete, it was based totally on, with an exception and a modification that I'll say in a minute, the inspiration was command and control, and in the sense of a almost a militarized principle, who imposed very severe sanctions on unruly agents. And so it worked within very important limits and for a certain time, but it did not address the underlying problems that are continued to deeply destabilize the Amazon and as manifest in a continuing and probably now growing threat to the environment. So I want to first say a word about those programs, and then I want to say why there is a call, quite broad-based and not limited. I mean, it's both a call with respect to Brazil, but it's equally heard with respect to Indonesia in very, very similar circumstances. Indonesia is Brazil. Well, you know this. I mean, you know the way your rubber plants went to Indonesia, their palm oil has come back. It's the same place with much of the same history, only really, really different people, as you know. So let me say a word about this and explain why the solution to the problem, almost, if there is a solution, it's not guaranteed, obviously, almost necessarily implies experimentalist methods. So the problem, what was tried, as you know, and I'll be very brief about this, was the list of priority municipalities, but more generally, a combination of forestry codes, land registration, and then starting in 2004, increasing with a great severity in 2008, an almost unprecedented campaign to enforce environmental limits on the development of the Amazon. And the development of the Amazon is an unbelievable story. I mean, it's a fantastic story. And it's a story of one wave of immigration clashing with another, and endless struggles between the cattle people and the soy people and the migrants from the Northeast and the indigenous people and the riverine. I mean, it makes our West, our far West, look very tame. And it's important to keep this history in mind, because it was a combination of crony capitalism, ferocious apportionment of property rights to the rich and powerful, and with continuing encouragement of immigration and a social understanding of property, with these two things, of course, unequally present, but mixed together in a way that has kept the Amazon one of the most vital, socially vital areas in the world. So starting in 2008, this is, I think, unique in the annals of modern environmentalism. The state basically occupied municipalities on the priority municipality list with high rates of deforestation, and seized equipment, and the state intervention directed at the municipality as a whole to induce a kind of collective responsibility was backed up by coordinating measures inside the government to deny a public agricultural credit to farmers in non-conforming municipalities, and further backed up by private industry sanctions against soy and beef producers who could be accused of purchasing supply from non-conforming sources. The combination of this is just, in case you're wondering, it's basically never happened. This is, I suppose, the dream of some kind of environmentalists, but it's never happened with this degree of rigor. And it produced two results. The first was, of course, it did produce a shock to many municipalities, and it did, for a time, dramatically slow reduce the rates of deforestation. So it did have, it's not that it had no effect, it had an important effect, but has been quite credibly argued in a very recent podcast by Daniel Vargas, who some of you may know from the Getúlio Vargas in São Paulo. He has a terrific podcast, which, and there's much other literature, but I just listened to the podcast. It was really terrific. With the argument, I think correct, that without the addition of subsidies to consumers and implicitly to producers at the same time, to basically anesthetize a lot of the groups in the Amazon who were disadvantaged by the environmental interventions, they wouldn't have been so passive. So it was a combination of a kind of a severe quasi-military campaign to sanction wrongdoers, combined with a kind of a set of subsidies that made it, at least for a time, more palatable for people to stop expanding, the smallholders, the people in vulnerable positions, to stop expanding the frontier. So when we look 10 years later, the outcome, this is, of course, exacerbated by Bolsonaro, but a key point here is you can see this deterioration well before Bolsonaro comes to power. So it would be wrong to blame him for, maybe he's the worst of the excesses, but this is not the result of his policy alone by any means. There were some 60 municipalities that were put on the list of priority municipalities. Only 22 get off. Many stay on because for every one Paragominas, there's a São Félix do Xingu. There are lots of municipalities where there's not an elite that can come in and organize things and find some way of conciliating interests sufficiently to stop the expansion of the front to the forest. So there are many municipalities which are still on the list, and the forest frontier, the frontier of deforestation, is expanding westward along rivers and highways, but basically along the areas of older colonization now, and much deeper into the Amazonian forest. So what basically happened, this is interesting, because conceptually interesting, in addition to being, of course, a human tragedy. It's conceptually interesting because it put the traditional methods of control to a very radical test. You're never going to be able to do to environmental wrongdoers what the government of Brazil did under Lula for a period of years, and it didn't work. Basically, the smallholders, meaning dispossessed, vulnerable groups of many different kinds, having been drawn into the Amazon by the successive waves of land grabbing, are now a permanent feature. And if there's not a way found to help them find more productive occupations that cause them to reduce their pressure on the land, give them a decent living while reducing pressure on the land, the pressure on the land will continue, and there's really no foreseeable future for the Amazon that does not include a great deal of deforestation. So that's the background, and now what does that mean concretely? So concretely, it means that low productivity activities have to become more productive. So either small cattle grazing has to become more productive, reducing the pressure on the land, or it has to switch to something else. Maybe palm oil, but of course there are many disadvantages of that. But there are plenty of other crops that could be introduced. But doing any of this depends crucially, and now I get to the experimentalist part, on designing programs and regimes that have the features that I said at the outset, that they can't fully anticipate how this support is going to be provided to smallholders. This has been done in Brazil and many other places before, but almost as an informal accident. It's not that it can't be done, but to have a program of the size that's required, it has to be done systematically. And so it looks like the demands of a systematic intervention fly in the face of demands for interventions that can be customized to local circumstance, the circumstance of particular groups in particular places. But that's exactly the kinds of intervention that experimentalism is good at when it works. So the claim is now, we could, if there was more time, we could talk about what would have to change in agricultural extension, what would have to change in the nature of research with regard to new crops and cropping methods in order for such a program to work. We could give examples, little tiny examples of initiatives, many actually, many small initiatives in Brazil or in Indonesia that are actually working very actively on these problems. If you were just to now enter the discussion about these issues in either of these two countries, you would see that a large part of the NGO, more forward-thinking international intervention, as well as local groups that are tied to smallholders, are going in this direction. So this idea is not even wholly novel in the settings where it matters. Parts of it are worked out, but the fact is that it's still going to be a desperate gamble. So let me stop here. I know this is crazy and I apologize, but I wanted to get these two separate things on the table. Let me just say again what they are. So the first is that in private production and in the provision and in the operation of government, we've turned a corner. The methods, traditional methods, still embodied in most law, based on the idea of a stable world where problems can be worked out before solutions are agreed, converted into laws, transmitted, elaborated from laws into administrative edicts or into the plans of hierarchically organized corporations. That world it's not that it's gone, but it's passing. Institutions organized that way don't work at all, or at least not well. There are alternative institutions. I gestured at them. I gestured at their characteristics. I didn't describe any of them in enough detail to be credible, but I trust you can check for yourself whether I was getting too far ahead of the facts. Those kinds of institutions, let's say arguendo, exist. That's the first part. The second part is Brazil, environmentalism in the Amazon is a classic case of the both of the resolute application of traditional methods by an unlikely political alliance, but nonetheless, a resolute application of the traditional methods, and it didn't work. It's hard to imagine trying to achieve environmental stability in the Amazon by a further application of those methods, except under a regime too awful to contemplate. The alternative requires just the kind of contextualization that experimentalist organizations learning under uncertainty are supposed to be good at. The question for you is if the first part is believable, meaning you can find some credibility in the general arguments, is there any reason to think that they can be successfully applied in this urgent case? Thanks. Let me stop there and look for your commentary and criticism.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Sabel, for your introduction to the discussion. Always instigating us. And with no further ado, I pass to Isabela to make her comments and questions.
I don't hear.
I'm so sorry.
I don't hear. Okay.
Thank you. And you have given us a lot to think about here. But the main thing that I was thinking during your speaking, it is how this theory deals with a system like a Brazilian system, a federal system, that we have a federal level, state level, and local level. So my first question is, what do you think would be the main challenge to give an effective and a fast response across regulatory level when it's very centralized in federal government? Because now we have Bolsonaro, so it's the thing. So how do you think, what is the main challenge, and how to develop local capacities to deal with this period of time?
Thank you, Isabela. Professor Sabel, let's listen to Vitor and then some of the comments and my own comments, and then we start all over again.
Sure.
Tem que ligar o microfone. Vitor, teu microfone não está ligado. Eu não estou te ouvindo, Vitor. Vitor, I'm not listening to you. Your mic's not on.
Can you hear me now?
Now, yes.
All right. So, yeah. Sorry about that. For some reason, the computer changed the microphones between the screens here. So, I apologize. Professor Sabel, I want to just briefly echo Gustavo and Isabela, and thank you for joining us and talk about these pressing issues. And I like your idea about the disruption. In my own work, I'm trying to deal with this idea of environmental change and climate change being maybe what Polanyi would envision as being the great transformation, disrupting everything nowadays, moving ahead. And building on that, I just I have a question relating more to replication of successful experimentalist instruments. So scholars have used experimentalism to analyze public policies all around the world. I mean, which answers any questions about generalizability. And on top of my head, I can remember of your bootstrapping development article and examples coming from changes to the Chilean grape production as being related to wine exports. There are fishery management changes in Kenya pertaining also to fish exports to the European Union. And thinking about the context of the Amazon here, how can we think about, and public administrators more generally can think of processes to replicate successful implementation of experimentalist policies in places like Paragominas or Alta Floresta, but maybe that are not so related to the external market and exports like the other examples that I just talked about. Of course, I mean, the soybean is extremely related to the external market, but other types of crops and cattle in these parts of the Amazon, at least, maybe not so much. So it would be great for us in the Brazilian audience to understand in more detail how can we have other municipalities to try to mimic and emulate, I mean, these experimentalist arrangements from these two cases that you cited within the Amazon. Thank you.
So, Professor Sabel, I'm gonna add a question. I think it's not it's kind of related with Isabela's question. It's and I think I've already asked you this in the during your classes, and it's is that I see, and you have lots of works with very practical and interesting aspects or uses of experimentalism, and what I don't see it's because you know you have this belief in command and control administration and the necessity of building capacity and dealing with uncertainty with an administration that is able to be more flexible in implementation of public policies. But I always think that I don't see something like an experimentalist proposition in the political level, like in the institutional design of society. Like, is there any proposition or studies you think that that could address the problems of the best institutional design, like to apply experimentalist policies? What I mean is like we understand, and it's kind of disturbing, of course, that the old methods, the idea of command and control, the idea of principal agent in the application of norms hasn't been working. In fact, but the use of experimentalist methods has to be preceded for some decision, some political decision to apply this method, and like how you have any idea of what would be better institutional design in the political level, constitutional design, you think would be more appropriate to experimentalist practices in public administration, in the implementation of public policies?
Okay, so these are all fundamental questions. So let me, Gustavo, let me say something about your question first, and then go to Isabella's and Vitor's, which are more closely linked with each other. This is I'm interpreting the question as what is as getting into the area that I bracketed, that I put aside, but of course you really can't put it aside, which is the connection of political decision making to what looks like more administrative decision making. So how do you? So that's a fundamental issue. How do you go from a world of political parties with their projects to where they are making commitments to the public, the voters, and competing with each other, to a world where you have to presume that things are provisional and ideas have to be changed. So what's the relation between, right? That's the commitments that are necessary to have democratic politics, a clash of different views. And okay, now I just completed a kind of project with a group in Finland about this very question, commissioned by the Finnish government, the Prime Minister's office. And the question was, how do we organize? How do we organize the link between parliamentary government, the campaign commitments, parliamentary oversight, and administration that's going to be experimentalist in this way? So, and this is embarrassing. To my surprise, I didn't have initially great ideas about this, and they had a bunch of hunches and interesting emergent practices, and that came out of the fact that politicians in Finland are generally recognizing that they have to be honest with the electorate, that there are some projects where they can't say precisely what the outcome will be, and many projects where, like in the environment, for example, where the realization will go inevitably across many legislative periods. And so I could start to, what my suggestion is, just to focus on these other questions for a minute, is that I send you and you can make available to anyone else who's listening, if you find it interesting, that you look at the report of this group, which was a report to the Prime Minister's office, and see whether this begins to answer your questions. And but the basic idea is that the politicians have to make basically create with Parliament, with their corresponding forces in Parliament, have to begin to create longer term commitments and get in return oversight capacities that let them see more deeply into what public administration is doing. So it's going to be a change in how politicians connect to Parliament, Parliament connects to the administration, and the question is, what will voters think about that? What will the public think about that? But what I'm really saying is that for the first time, I had the feeling that the question that you put, which I always have regarded as an urgent question that I didn't know, is becoming practical enough so that people are starting to do something about it. And then that makes it much easier to think about it. So let me just stop there, but with apologies for not going into the details of this project, but that's the beginning of something that wasn't there before, at least for me. So let me turn to your question, Isabella, which is for Brazil, but also in the United States, of course, a very fundamental question, because we have a strong federal system, but it doesn't, for example, cities in the United States are not independent of the states in which they exist. So a state can preempt a big city like New York. A state can prohibit New York from making the kinds of rules that it needs to make to address the environment. And of course, in the United States now, federalism is very broken. So even though in theory there could be in our system a kind of exchange between the levels, the state level is not as restricted as it is in Brazil. Even so, there has not been in recent years much exchange. We'll see whether there's a new age of a kind of cooperative federalism on more experimentalism lines now that, at least in parts of the country, in dialogue with the Biden administration. But even if there is, that doesn't answer your question about what to do in Brazil, which I understand is an urgent question. Now, digging into the story of the Amazon, it quickly became clear that much Brazilian centralization is relatively new. That is, the military, when the dictatorship seized control of lots of land and interrupted whatever process was beginning to emerge of more state and municipal autonomy. I don't want to overdo how much there was under the military, even before the military regime, but the military went out of its way to centralize things, and the Constitution of '88 does something, but as you're saying, the state capacities are terribly limited. So a first question is, what are the actual limitations imposed by law, and what are the de facto limitations that come from the unwillingness of the state governments to actually develop their capacities? I understand from discussions with Vitor and Gustavo, and from a bunch of reading that I've done myself, the state is trying to develop municipal capacities, and you get all kinds of different views about how successful they are. But so it's more of a question than an answer, is there's no doubt that you're right in the way you characterize the situation, as the states and municipalities having a very, very limited capacities, certainly not the capacities they need for anything like this experimentalist program. So that's we just agree. And if they don't get those capacities, there won't be, then maybe command and control better work, because that's all there will be. But as I'll explain a little bit more when I come to Vitor's question about generalizability, these solutions are going to have to be very local, because there's huge variety within the Amazon, and like in general, but particularly in the Amazon. So if there's not local capacity, there really won't be solutions. So the first question I would have back to you and anyone else is, what happens when a state and a municipality try to actually develop these capacities? Do they get support? Can they get support from Norway? Even if they can't get some support from the Brazilian state, is it possible? Do we have examples of that? There was an incipient, just the beginning discussion of it. I don't know the answer to that, but I do know in the United States, very big cities, which do have the capacity to do a lot of environmental stuff, have not even begun to really develop it. It's only very recently that they've actually begun to build up their capacities. And we don't know what they can and can't do, what limits they're going to run into until they start to run into some limits. So this is, I guess what I'm saying is, if you had a choice between saying we need a constitutional reform to reallocate power from the center to the local governments, to lower level governments. That's one possibility. Or we can start building local capacity and then see what new powers need to be developed. I would choose the second, because we have examples from Brazil, like participatory budgeting, which was made possible by the '88 Constitution, and it flourished for a while and then it stopped flourishing. It's really was more a matter of local capacity than absolute limit imposed by the state. And I wonder whether that's not in some measure the same thing here. But let me stop there and just say a word about Vitor's question. And but I want to underscore that if there was one question to ask about this, that's the one. Because if there is no, if there's no local capacity, if there's some limit on the development of local capacity, good night. There's just nothing that can be done. There are reasons the central states are very reluctant to exercise that kind of control, because it makes them responsible for everything that goes on at the local level, and that's not so attractive either, however much power is attractive. But let me come to Vitor's question. There's a lot of very good research, including research by your friends, Vitor, Masoka, and so on, that shows you both the heterogeneity and the regularities in the Amazon, for example. So, you know, the 500 and some municipalities, they group into a number of pretty coherent types. There's the soy frontier and the cattle frontier and the forest. You know, they identify four types, which with a, you know, it's a kind of a pretty straightforward social science exercise. But it's probably right. It's probably right that you can distinguish a number of different types, and so you can understand why things worked in Paragominas or Alto Floresta, and they didn't work in São Felipe do Xingu. So you can get that far. That's about, you don't, and something that works in one part of the cattle frontier will have some application in another part of the same cattle frontier. It's not going to be that different. But, and this goes back to the key thing, that's, you don't really care. The point is not that you want to find a generalizable solution and then generalize it, because the problems are going to change. You want to build an organization, and this is I'll say, one reason to think this is an urgent task for Brazil in general. You want to build an organization that can help people build local capacities to improve productivity and to do it in a way that's compatible with the environment. And you want them to be able, that has to be customizable at the local level. So even though you could identify regularities and you can think some ideas will surely be applicable outside the domain where they're developed, the goal is in each place to develop the capacity for more differentiated response. So let me say one word about just to make the whole problem a bigger and either more urgent or more overwhelming. Maybe both. And this is a variant of this problem applies to the United States. So I'm not very directly. So I'm not picking on Brazil here. Brazil is deindustrializing, and productivity has been stagnant for many, many years. That's creating a time bomb. We have a similar problem. We have, a third of the society which is excluded from the advanced sector, and its conditions of life are slowly degrading. That's who, very crudely, that's who's voting for Trump. It's more complicated, but many of the core voters are coming from these devastated communities where there are no good jobs. They're just gone. We need to rebuild the capacity to, in our country, to regenerate the economy in order to have a political economy that's compatible in the long term with democracy. Doing that requires two things. It requires increasing the capacities of the workforce, helping people learn new things, but it also means working very closely with firms to help them adopt production methods and business strategies that allow them to make use of people with higher capacities, to make use of the flexibility of a better workforce. That means a massive program of support, and it's exactly the same kind of problem that we're talking about in the Amazon. And trust me, if you've been in these little factories or big factories in Ohio, the ones that are not in good shape, you wouldn't think you were in the first world. So I want to be clear. I understand that a very reasonable reaction to what I'm saying is, are you crazy? It's one thing to say government isn't working. It's another thing that may be, it's not working. Traditional government isn't working. It's another thing to say there are a bunch of workable alternatives with interesting conceptual, counterintuitive properties. But what you're proposing is a massive program that depends on a bunch of government organizations we don't have yet. And as Isabella pointed out, in some places we may be barred by existing laws from having them. But that is what I'm proposing. Because I don't think the example of the failures of the intervention, the list of priority municipalities and the car and all the rest in the Amazon, the lesson is that other stuff doesn't work. And we need solutions.
All right. So thank you very much, Professor Sabel. We have some observations from the audience, and I think we can get back again to the Alta Floresta and Paragominas case, let's say, to talk about the subsidies to the smallholders, the agriculture in these cities. One of the question is about so what you say.
I see it. I just read it. I just read the question. Yeah.
Perfect.
So let me answer that question, because the natural reflex is to say, okay, we're going to do this through incentives, subsidies. And maybe you could even, so that's exactly the principal agent model that I was talking about at the beginning. So we'll establish subsidies to pay, and that will redirect behavior, that was tried in a kind of not very elegant way with Red Plus in the Amazon to pay people for environmental services and so on and so forth. But what I'm proposing is different. It's not about incentives, and it's not about welfare subsidies of the kind that were given under the Lula government to consumers. It's about a productivist intervention. It's about services to help workers, agricultural, the farmers, agriculturalists, and firms to become more productive, to learn to do different things better. So that involves money. It's not that it's free. It can involve a lot of resources, but it's not principally about giving subsidies. Because when you give subsidies, there are two possibilities. One is the money is sufficient. That is, all people want is the money. So they want a certain, they'll be content if they just have the additional income. Experience is they're not content if that just doesn't work in the long term for many reasons. The other possibility is that you can actually pay somebody to acquire new skills. Like you say, look, if you become more productive, you'll get a bonus or an award. And that would be a subsidy to learning something new. And the problem with that is that individuals by themselves find it very hard to learn to do new things, even if there's a promise of a reward at the end. Try that with yourself sometime. Just, it takes a lot of support and learning with other people who are in the situation that you are in, and many complicated services to be able to learn to change what you can do. And that's what we're talking about here, is that doing something that sounds simple, going from low productivity to high productivity cattle grazing, is enormously demanding. It means paying much closer attention to everything you do and knowing much more about learning very rapidly what the consequences are of doing this rather than that. It's a completely different way of farming or cattle raising. It works, it's very demanding. Almost nobody, unless you're, middle class or above, you don't learn to do it yourself. You learn it in groups with support. And so this is not about, it is about increased resources for these kinds of smallholders, speaking about the Amazon, maybe massive increases in that, but it's not about subsidies.
So it would be like, it would be more a work of Embrapa than IBAMA in talking.
Yes, it would be exactly Embrapa, not IBAMA. That's exactly the difference.
Isabela
and by the way, Embrapa used to be, Embrapa does a lot of things, but it used to be very good at this in some settings. So it's not, but that's a separate discussion, which I'm glad to have. This is these extension services and research institutions, they too probably have to be, they do a lot of this already. They could do a lot more, and reconfiguring them is not trivial. But yes, that's what it would be, a new Embrapa.
So, Vitor, Isabela, you have some more observations? Feel free to do it.
Well, I have a related question. Then it's still playing around with this idea, Professor Sabel, of subsidies, and unless you are a middle class or you have some resources as a cattle rancher, and this makes me think about the critique of trickle-down economics. That from the top, people learn at the bottom. But in this case, would it be a way, of thinking about changing environmental practices, say, if middle class or rich cattle ranchers start changing their productions, would that be capable of creating a spillover effect that reaches smallholders, like in their properties, in terms of changing their environmental practices in their turn?
The short answer is no. No. Let me say something in detail about that. There's a study with my friend Piero Ghezzi. We just did a study of smallholders in Peruvian agriculture, and where we looked into a lot of these things. It's on my website if anyone's interested. So here's first of all, larger property owners in the Amazon and elsewhere they have pretty much direct experience of the limits of unecological farming. So many of them adopt at least some measure of environmentally sustainable agriculture. This is not news to them. Of course, there are exceptions and renegades and all this, but it's not like they really need to be convinced. In a place like the Amazon, they know what happens if you don't pay attention to this and the cost to the land and to you. So that's the first thing. The second thing is they will invest in helping smallholders learn these things. That's not trickle down. It's not like they do it and then the smallholders say, "Oh, what a good idea! I'll do it." This stuff is hard. This is you don't just learning to do these things is it's not just learning to break old habits. It's really learning to do different things and to think in a new way about things without abandoning. It's not that your old expertise is irrelevant, but it has to be integrated in a new way. So in many cases, the smallholders are suppliers to the larger farmers. They grow the same thing and they use the farmer's infrastructure to get to the market. And it can be efficient for the large farmer because they don't have to invest in land and worry about it. So when it turns out that a bunch of side conditions are met and the large holder can successfully recover the investment in helping the smallholder meet the new requirements and learn the new capacities, they invest. And they do it. It's just they're very conscious of what those conditions are. And when they're not met, it's too bad for everybody. The reason a big public intervention is necessary is because there are a lot of places where improvement would be pretty easily possible. It's just not going to be profitable for the big private firm to invest itself. That's an externality. It's a positive externality. Okay, so that's a from the point of view of the simple economics of it. That's what's going on. You have to create an extension service that can help the smallholders learn to do the things that they can't learn directly by a spillover or through investment by the big farmers. But it's feasible. I mean, there are when you can also turn this around and you can say, can you find smallholders who are already doing all the demanding things? And the answer is, you bet, of course. So we know this is possible. It's hard to organize. Is that clear? Does that? Okay.
Yes, thank you.
Well, all right. We've put on the comments some of at least one of the articles of Professor Sabel for anyone who wants to read it. I've already also indicated some readings in social media, in Facebook, in Instagram before the event, and it's been really great to listen to you, Professor Sabel. I think we're good. I think it's been an interesting and really enlightening event. Really, it's always enlightening to listen to you, Professor Sabel. Thank you so very much.
Well, thank you, Gustavo, and thank you all. This was a lot of fun for me just to begin to think through some of this stuff. I confess I'm about to write something based on this. So if anything I said is too horribly wrong, somebody should please send me a delicate note saving me from great public embarrassment and just point it out. So I very much appreciate your questions, Isabela and Vitor and Gustavo and everyone else. And I hope there's another occasion for a Café Democrático.
Thank you. Just, Isabela, you want to say something else? Vitor, please, you can also say, I think I should have asked Isabela or Vitor if they are okay with ending the live, but I think we are good, but listen to you.
Just say thank you so much for talking to us. It was a pleasure.
Great.
Yeah, likewise. I mean, again, just echo both of them, and thanks very much, Professor Sabel, for this enlightening discussion. Like you, I'm going to go back to my writing on this. So, yeah, hopefully we can all go back and discuss these issues in another Café Democrático as well. So thank you very much. We really appreciate it.
Thanks. Take care, guys.
Okay, take care. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, everybody, for being here with us. Thank you, Isabela. Thank you, Vitor. And I hope I can have other opportunities to listen to you, Professor Sabel. It's always enlightening. Thank you very much, everyone. Good evening, good night. Boa noite.
Boa noite.